Thank you very much. Senator Wong, if you don't mind, Senator Ludlam has been waiting for 5 or so minutes of questions, if that's okay. So I'll go to Senator Ludlam.
Thanks, Chair. It shouldn't be any longer than that. It's matters that I've put on notice and had some responses. I put a set of questions to the Environment Department, and it's relating to 170 hectare parcel of land at Point Peron, just south of Perth in WA, Point Peron.
Point Peron.
Yeah. The Environment Department, as is proper, referred me to Finance. So it's as I say, it's 170 hectare parcel of land at Point Peron was transferred from the Commonwealth to the state of WA on the condition that it was preserved as a reserve and used only for recreation and for parklands. Are you aware of that precinct?
I'm aware, but I'll need the other officers to fill you in. Point Peron. Yeah, I'll take the drink. Get going.
G'day and welcome to the table. Sorry we kept you waiting. Are you all have a degree of familiarity with the part of the world that I'm talking about, that I'm referring to? Yep. Chair, when you step out of the room for just a second, things go to pieces.
I'm sorry. I'm sorry I missed that.
Oh, never, ever.
Senator Wong,
Senator
Wong, this is extraordinarily disrespectful of the Minister.
Even he's laughing.
And I can only imagine the response should Senator Ronaldson be mocking you while you're sitting at the top table. Now, I don't think it's appropriate.
To put out that he just...
There's always room. There's room for humour. We understand that, but not at others' expense. I think that's very true. Now,
I've actually been sitting here waiting for an hour. Can we just
thank you, Senator Collins. Senator Ludlam,
Thanks,
you have
Chair.
the call.
So this parcel of land was transferred from the Commonwealth to the state of WA in 1964, and there was an agreement that was confirmed, I guess, in 1968 that the parcel of land would be used or would not be used for private industrial, commercial or residential development. There's now a marina that's proposed there. It's gone through environmental impact assessment in WA, the so-called Mangles Bay Marina. So as far as your department is concerned, do the 1964 and 1968 agreements still stand? It was signed between WA and the Commonwealth.
Andrew Smith, Assistant Secretary, Business Procurement and Asset Management Group. The land was sold in 1964 to the West Australian Government. The sale was not was constituted by a transfer of letters between the then Prime Minister and the then Premier of Western Australia. The sale was on a concessional basis, and the concessional basis was on the basis that the land would be set aside for a reserve for recreation and park lands.
Yeah.
That was tested in 1968 when the West Australian Government wanted to develop some of the land for a sewage treatment plant and for some commercial transport facilities. And the Prime Minister responded at that time accepting that the West Australian Government could develop about 70 or 80 hectares, which I understand is about a half of the land, for that private for that use, as long as it wasn't used for private and commercial development.
Private, industrial, commercial or residential?
Residential development.
That sounds right.
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks for coming to the table with a bit of knowledge of the area that I'm after, because that'll make things a bit quicker. So you'd be aware then that the WA government is now a joint proponent in the Mangles Bay Marina. Based on what I've just outlined and your response, which is consistent with what I've got in front of me, would you, first of all, could you just confirm for me that those agreements from the 1960s are still in force? Haven't elapsed?
Those agreements were raised with the government in the year 2000 by the Western Australian Government. And at that stage, it was determined that there was no legal standing of those criteria.
They have no legal standing. So what on earth does that mean?
essentially, the government, the transfer of the land by letter didn't create a contract to sale and didn't create caveats on the land that prevented the land being transferred for a different purpose at a later stage by the Western Australian government.
So what was so as far as you're concerned, the proposal to dig the area up and put a marina on it wouldn't be in breach of those agreements because they're not enforceable in any way?
That would be my understanding at this time.
What happened in 2000 then that made that... what's the basis of that comment that you've made that in the year 2000 that was tested?
Legal advice was obtained in 2000
By whom?
by the Department of Finance and Administration.
Has that ever been put into the public domain?
I couldn't say whether it has or not.
I'm not asking you to do it tonight. Well, could you take on notice for us whether that legal advice has ever been made public?
I would take on notice and search, but I'm not sure I'll be able to find out for sure.
I'm not asking you to table it tonight, but you should at least know whether it's a public document or not. All right, anyway, you've undertaken to take that on notice. What was the trigger for that advice being sought?
The West Australian Government sought advice from the department at that stage as whether or not they could proceed with a development on that land.
Okay, so nonetheless, it's maybe useful that Senator Wong is here because I've got, as the former Minister for Finance and Deregulation, a letter here on her letterhead dated 17 November 2011.
From me?
Yeah, from me at the time.
I'm not some random person using my letterhead.
From you.
From me?
I'm not allowed to put a question to you, which is kind of a shame.
Well, we could just have asked me.
Noting that the federal government has an expectation that the WA government will honour the undertakings previously given in relation to the site. If an agreement between a Premier and a Prime Minister of the Commonwealth isn't enforceable and is effectively worthless, what does that tell us about, why would you sign an agreement like that in the first place if it has no standing? That's just exceptionally deceptive conduct, is it not?
I can't comment on the circumstances that led to the signing of those letters, Senator. There was probably an intention to do the right thing, but under the law of the time, the letters did not constitute a formal agreement to preserve a reserve to today.
Okay. So is it present government policy to still do the right thing?
I haven't had the opportunity to brief the government on this, Senator.
Okay. Has the West Australian government approached the Commonwealth to alter its original agreement, or is it your contention that they wouldn't need to?
In 2000, they approached the government and the government responded in a letter that said we had no legal rights.
Could you table a copy of that letter for us?
I haven't got a copy with me, but I will take on notice.
For the committee. Thanks. So what kind of precedent would you say that this sets? That an undertaking which was made public between Prime Minister and a Premier of a state that is effectively worthless?
The law at the time was quite different to laws today transferring property, and there were some significant elements of the transfer that happened in 64 that meant that the land couldn't be reserved as an A-grade reserve, and that's where the legal fact falls apart, Senator.
All right. Now you've got to be a bit careful here because I'm not able to ask you for legal advice. So you're doing pretty well so far. I've actually got a copy of the 64 agreement here in front of me, which by a bizarre coincidence was signed on my birthday. But if I need to go back to Western Australia at the end of this week, and I'll be telling residents that that document is effectively worthless, that there's no commitment.
Senator, Jan Mason, Deputy Secretary, Business Procurement and Asset Management. I think to set it in context, it's probably fair to observe that the exchange of letters in 1964 is now some almost 60 years ago, and whilst it might have represented a clear statement of the intention of the parties at the time, There's been a lot of time that's elapsed since that period, and trying to point back to that as a legally binding agreement.
No,
between
government
the
sign
parties is-
treaty instruments that last for hundreds of years. So at what point does a signed agreement between a state and the Commonwealth become worthless just because it was a while ago? Like, how long would elapse before a document ceases to have any legal force? Or
Well, I
value?
think Mr Smith's been through it, that we don't think, we've had advice that indicates that we don't think it is a legally binding agreement at this.
Just because it was
this
signed a while ago.
I think Mr Smith's been through it, that there's been a lot that's changed since that time, and it's probably fair to also observe that the amount of detail in the exchange of letters is much less than one might anticipate being in such an agreement at this time.
It doesn't need a great deal of detail. It just said the land shouldn't be ruined by industrial or residential development. I mean, it's not the sort of thing you need a great deal of detail to describe. Mr Smith, don't let me verbal you here, but you had said you hadn't had time to brief the government, the new government, on this matter. Is that what you just said?
That's correct, Senator.
Okay. So what's your view as to the merit, at least if not the letter of the law, the spirit of the agreement, as to the state government proposing a private marina right in the middle of this reserve? Yeah, I'll wrap up.
Thank you.
I'll just finish up there. Would you conclude that a private marina, if not breaching the letter of this agreement, breaches the spirit of it comprehensively? It's utterly at odds with what's on paper.
I don't think that's an issue that we should form a judgment on, Senator. I think you can form your own judgment on that, and others can as well.
I think others will form a very, very severe judgment.
That's where we should leave it, I think.
When will you be advising the new government? I know it's only been, what has it been, 10, 11 weeks. When will you be advising the new government on this project or this proposal?
I imagine I'll do that shortly, Senator.
Yeah, you might now. Okay, thanks for your time.
Thank you, Senator Ludlam.